guys, welcome back to the Psalms to Guide YouTube channel. This is the journaling hour. If you are new, welcome for the first time. There are links in the description box as well as just general information about all of the supplies that I will be using in tonight's video for my journal entry if you would like to follow along or create your own journal in a similar style. If you have been tuning in, welcome back. It's good to see you again. Tonight, we're going to be studying 3 different women continuing in the letter A. We will be studying Abital, the daughter of Abraham, and Achsah. And so I'm really excited to jump in and study these 3 women. I do have footage for me journaling for all 3 of them. However, in this particular video, I will be speeding up that footage. Most of the videos I have out in the series, I left everything in real time and I'm just talking through the study in the same amount of time that it takes me to actually write out the study. These, however, I have sped up for the interest of time. Just as an FYI for those who are following along and are curious, it actually took me about an hour and a half to do all of the journaling that you will see in this video. So if you look at the timestamp, you'll see I didn't speed it up that much, but I do want to disclaim that the video is sped up. That being said, let's say a quick prayer and then jump into the study. Father, thank you for bringing us together to give us a platform and a space where we can come and learn and meet together, to strengthen our relationship with you, to learn more about what you've said in your word, and to see the examples that you've set before us, whether good examples that we should model ourselves after or bad examples that we should learn from and make sure not to model ourselves after. I pray that you will be in our hearts and in our minds as we go through this study and help us to learn things and to see what you have for us in our lives and how we should apply it. In your son, Jesus' name, amen. So the first woman we are going to talk about today is Abital or Abital. Pronunciation is always interesting. Hebrew is definitely not my first language, so I'm never really 100% positive of how to pronounce the name. I will go ahead and do the meaning of the name before we jump into who she was and discuss all of that. But as with the other names that we've gone through before, that start with this prefix Abi or Abi, which means my father, her name means my father is the dew, which is it's a very interesting meaning altogether. But that is the name Abital. She is discussed in 2 Samuel chapter 3 verse 4 and 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 3. She is the wife of David, one of David's many wives, and she is called out in the genealogies in these 2 chapters where they're discussing the lineage of David. So she is called out as being one of his wives and for giving birth to David's 5th son, a man named Shephatiah. This is interesting because, the Israelites were kind of obsessed with genealogies. They kept track of the lineages meticulously, and to a certain extent, this doesn't really make sense to most of us today. We typically skip over this, particularly those of us in the US, because we don't have a monarchy. I mean, we do have some nepotism and stuff that happens in the United States, but for the most part, things in the United States are either you're voted in or you earn your way in through like promotions and things like that. So we don't really think so much about genealogies and lineages. It's becoming a little bit more popular, particularly with things like 23andMe and Ancestry and stuff like that. But even so, we're not really known for going back and being able to say who our great 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 grandparents are, and even more so as an African American, I can't get past, the 1865 wall. I don't even think I can get to 1865, to be honest. But in the Israelite culture, they kept track of this because it was important for not only the royal family and the succession of the throne, as you will see in modern cultures like in Europe, particularly in like the UK with like Prince Charles and Prince Harry, or actually it's King Charles now, Prince William, Prince Harry. Um, if you go into England, a lot of people will be able to tell you like how they relate to the royal family, and you might meet people who are like 40th or 50th in line for the throne, and they're never going to be king of England or queen of England, but they know that relationship because there is a small chance that they could end up at the throne. A similar thing exists here when we talk about the lineage of David, because this is where the Messiah is to come from. Israel had already been given prophecies about many things concerning the coming Messiah, that the Messiah would come from Judah, that there would rise a king in Judah, and things like that. And so we know that the king has to come from this lineage. So it makes sense to keep track of all of the people, not just who succeeds the father and becomes king, but to know that these are other people, particularly when David is first on the scene. It's like, well, which son is this Messiah going to come from? So it makes sense that the early writers of Israelite history would have recorded all the sons of David and not just Solomon. So we get information about Shephatiah. Now, unlike many of David's sons, Shephatiah is not particularly noteworthy. We don't get any other stories about him that I can think of off the top of my head. He may be mentioned a couple of times, maybe in talking about like a battle or something. I would have to double check that. But he does not ring a bell in my mind the way David's other sons like Amnon or Absalom or Adonijah, right? These sons either did something like Amnon raped his sister. You have Absalom, who tried to overthrow David. You have Adonijah, who also tried to overthrow David. Of course, you have Solomon, who becomes the king after David, right? These sons are all very much noteworthy, and so you wouldn't be surprised to see the biblical authors note who their mothers are. Whereas Shephatiah is not someone that you really think of or have like a grand story around. So it seems a little, I don't want to say unnecessary, but it seems a little jarring that his mother is mentioned specifically by name. But I think it's also a testament that the people writing this out thought she was important enough to mention by name. And that's part of why I'm going through and looking at every woman mentioned, because I want to point out that even though there may not be a ton of information about this woman, and we may not have gotten all of the nitty-gritty details about her and her life and her relationship with David and like how she was as a mother and all of this other stuff, they did find her important enough to mention her, and they did give her credit as being a wife and being the mother of one of David's sons. So the next woman we're going to talk about is the daughter of Abraham. Now, before you get really confused and wonder what you missed because you've never heard about Abraham's daughter, she is not literally the daughter of Abraham. This woman is actually talked about in Luke 13. Her story starts in verse 10, and it's really more of a generic term that is used to refer to her specifically in Luke 13:11. This is sort of what I was alluding to or talking about in the previous episode, where I mentioned that in the Bible, there is a habit of shortening distant relationship with just the word daughter or son. There is no adding of the word great to be like the great, 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 granddaughter. There is no granddaughter, right? There is just daughter of Abraham, even though this woman exists during the New Testament time and is a good, 2,000 probably years removed from Abraham's existence. And this was very common. This phrase, daughter of Abraham, could be taken in so many different ways. In today's society, people say daughter of Abraham or son of Abraham just to reference being a follower of God, being within the kingdom, and it could apply to literal descendants of Abraham as well as spiritual descendants of Abraham. But also, even within the literal context and the biological context, this doesn't necessarily have to mean Israelite. The sons and daughters of Abraham are Hebrew in general, but this would also include the Ishmaelites. This would include the Edomites, right? All of these people are also descended of Abraham, the Midianites. There were lots and lots of people within this family tree. Now, given the context of the verse, I believe she probably was an Israelite, and she was probably also from the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Levi or Benjamin, those that were in the southern kingdom, because the time period is that of after the Babylonian exile, after the Assyrian exile. So the 10 tribes of the north had already been carried away, and most of what made up Israel at this point were those who returned from the Babylonian captivity. And so, in that regard, like I said, it makes sense that she would be from the tribe of Judah, which was the largest tribe that returned, or from the tribe of Levi, possibly from the tribe of Benjamin, as all of them were living in Judah. And because they did not particularly associate with, the Edomites or the Ishmaelites, it seems less likely that one of them would have been seeking out Jesus for this purpose. So that is why I think that that's what her lineage was. But like I said, the title is vague and could mean a variety of things. Now, what happened with this woman is that she had been plagued by some sort of illness that kept her from standing upright, and she had been suffering this for 18 years. Y'all, 18 years is a long time to not be able to stand up straight and to be in pain and sick. But she had been battling this for 18 years, and this was placed upon her from a spirit. Some spirit had, I guess, cursed her with this and caused this illness. And so she goes to the Messiah on a Sabbath and he heals her. And this, of course, causes an issue with the synagogue leaders that see him do this healing. They are upset, they scold him, and they rebuke him for healing on the Sabbath, to which the Messiah rebukes them. And, it starts to tell us that it is always okay to heal on the Sabbath. This goes into deeper conversations about how Messiah viewed keeping the Sabbath and what the importance of the Sabbath is. I have a couple of I have a couple of blog posts on my blog. I don't know if I have any episodes on the podcast or on here about the Sabbath, but that's a larger conversation. Nonetheless, she is, of course, thankful that she has been healed, and so she glorifies God and praises and thanks the Messiah for healing her of this condition. So, looking at this story, I mean, obviously, as I already kind of alluded to, there are sub studies you could do on, for instance, the Sabbath and what it means to keep the Sabbath. But focusing in on her, there were a couple of things that I had questions about, and a couple of things that stand out. So, obviously, she had some sort of faith that she went to Messiah to be healed, but the questions that I had were, for instance, like, how old was she? We know she was at least 18 because she had been plagued with this illness for 18 years. Whether that is her whole life or her whole adult life, or whether she, became plagued as a child, is not told to us. So we don't know how old. She could have been as young as 18, but she could have been in her 30s. She could have been in her 40s. She could have been in her 60s for all we know. Um, it really isn't told to us because, I mean, I guess in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. But I'm always just curious how old the people are that we're talking about and what they're going through. The other thing that I was curious about is what kind of spirit causes illness, and like how do you become affected by these spirits? Like, we often talk about demonic presence and demonic entities. I mean, I do think people have talked about, you know, sickness being demonic or being the result of demonic activity, but I was definitely curious, like, what is it that she did that I guess put her in alignment or an agreement with this spirit that allowed this illness on her? And it goes into these deeper questions of, when you want to rebuke a spirit, can you rebuke a spirit of your own doing, or do you need a prophet, a healer, a um, someone outside of you to intercede and to pray and to rebuke that spirit, to heal you and to cleanse you of whatever is happening in your life, that's going wrong. That's one of the things I thought about in this story, because I mean, there's lots of things that could be happening. She may not have known that it was a spirit that was causing this illness, in which case she wouldn't know to rebuke that spirit. But if you know that a particular spirit or demon is causing your illness and you want to rebuke it, I mean, in the 18 years she had not done that. She came to Messiah. Would she have been able to do that on her own? That is kind of the line of thought and questioning, is, how much warfare can we take on ourselves for ourselves? Or is this the entire purpose of fellowship, that the body is supposed to be doing this for us and taking over this role that Messiah showed in healing her? So those were some of the interesting points that I thought about the daughter of Abraham. Again, this is in Luke chapter 13. She is never given a specific name or any specific details about who she is or who she's related to outside of this title of a daughter of Abraham. Okay, so the final person we are going to talk about in this study for tonight is Achsah. Achsah was the daughter of Caleb. Now, before we start talking about Achsah, let's talk about Caleb for a minute, because, as I mentioned earlier, genealogy was important, but also just for context to understand who she is, what kind of upbringing she might have had, and what kind of environment she would have been in. This is also going to give you more of a time period, a timeline of when she was alive. Caleb is one of the 12 spies that were sent into Canaan when Israel was in the wilderness and they were getting ready to launch the invasion of Canaan to establish themselves there. So the 12 spies go in and they see the Canaanites, and 10 of the spies basically chicken out and say that they're no match for the Canaanite army and that they should not proceed. Two of those spies are like, nah, we got this. God told us we were going to do this and we're going to do this. And those two spies were Joshua, who you're probably more familiar with, and Caleb, Achsah's father. So this is the lineage that Achsah is coming from, the devoted Caleb, the faithful, the trusting in God type of a man that was bold and ready to stand on God's promises. That is who fathered Achsah. That is who raised this young woman. And I think that is important for context. So she is discussed in Joshua 15, in Judges 1, and again in 1 Chronicles chapter 2. Some of these verses are identical. So the verses in Joshua and in Judges are primarily identical. And then in 1 Chronicles, it's just more so of a lineage and her, just discussing her in this lineage. But her story is very interesting. It is one of arranged marriage. So Caleb tells the men of their area that whoever goes and captures this particular city, that they can have his daughter as a wife. This gives me like Brave vibes, right? Like this is like all of the stories where it's the man who wins this tournament, or like I think in Shrek it's like the man who slays the dragon or whatever. They get the woman as a wife. This is sort of even in Mulan, this concept of they go to war and they come back and they get a wife. So really, it seems strange in our society today, but I feel like this was a common thing because, like I said, it appears in many cultures, not just Israelite culture, where there was this promise of a wife if they went and showed this victory or achieved this victory. And so this is the position that Achsah has been placed in. And the man who accomplishes this task for Caleb is a man named Othniel. And Othniel is actually Caleb's nephew. And he marries Achsah. And then she tells her husband that he should ask Caleb for land. And so when Othniel asks Caleb for the land, Caleb seems to realize that this is a request from Achsah and actually addresses Achsah directly and asks what all she wants, to which she says that she wants this land and she wants the springs or the springs of water that flow through this land. And Caleb is like, yeah, sure. And he gives her this land. And so, that is probably the most important part of the story. We're going to break this apart and talk about some of the symbolism and the deepness and the ramifications of this. But in addition, she is mentioned, of course, in lineages, and we're told about, her, and like we're told that her mother's name is Makkah. There are a couple of passages that talk about sons of Caleb, which would be her brothers. There's a lot of different lists and they don't line up exactly one to one. I did not go back and try to put them together, as I've mentioned in many videos. The genealogies are very interesting because they don't always match but not because they're necessarily contradicting, but because the purpose of them is different. And as I mentioned just recently, people are called the son of or the daughter of when really it's the grandson or the granddaughter or the great grandson and the great granddaughter. And so it's hard to say in some of these lists if this is like a direct child of the person or if this is a grandchild of the person. Um, and within this, that makes it hard to say which of these sons of Caleb's are actually Achsah's brothers or maybe like her nephews or something like that. In the grand scheme of things, it's not really that important. The one thing that I would point out about these people existing is that she did have brothers, which means that she was not the only child or the only daughter. Well, she might have been the only daughter. Like, Caleb had sons that he could leave his inheritance to, is what I'm trying to get at. Now, I bring that up because there is a law given in Numbers 27 stating that if a man did not have sons, that he could give his land and his inheritance to his daughters. So women were, in fact, allowed to own and inherit property according to the Old Testament. And the only thing that was specified was that they had to marry within their tribe, which Achsah does because Othniel is her first cousin. But this, like, the rationale behind this is because, God divided the land up amongst the tribes, and the lineage passed from father to son. So in this case, Achsah is from the same tribe as her father, and Othniel is also from the same tribe as her father. So their child would still be part of this tribe. So when their child inherits the land, it's still within that tribe. However, if Achsah had gone and married a man from a different tribe, then her child would be seen as being from that tribe. And so when the child inherited the land would shift from being part of this tribe and be part of that tribe. So this concept of them having to marry within their tribe was to maintain the boundaries of these portions of land. So what we see here is very interesting. Okay, let's talk about Achsah and who she was, what this story tells us about her, before we jump into any of the other things. The first thing that I thought of when I read this is that she is displaying obedience. She complies with the marriage that Caleb has arranged. We're not told whether like he discussed this with her beforehand or whether she found out with the rest of, the nation or the surrounding area. We don't know how she felt about it. Like, was she thrilled that she was going to be getting married and that her husband would be a successful soldier? Excuse me. Was she nervous? Was she upset? Right? I grew up in the early, I was born in the late 80s, so I grew up with 90s Disney. So stuff like Aladdin comes to mind, where the entire story is about them trying to marry off the princess, and she's very apprehensive to this. She wants to choose for herself. The same story goes for like Brave, which is a little bit more modern. And, there's like this competition, and whoever wins is supposed to get the princess's hand in marriage. And she's like, I don't want to be married, right? And she's very much against it. And in true Disney form, both of these princesses kind of rebel against their father's wish for them to get married, and they actively work against the tradition, and they find a way to get out of this arranged marriage situation. But Achsah doesn't do this. She actually marries the man that Caleb has promised to her. And We don't know what their relationship was like, whether that was a happy marriage or what, but she goes along with it. She is obedient. And we're going to come back to this concept of obedience um, when we get into what this means for us today. But in addition to her being obedient, she is bold and direct. And again, this is one of the things that I've been noticing while studying the women of the Bible is that, yes, a lot of the traits that are typically promoted within church, obedience, submissiveness, meekness, etc., they are very much present in the women of the Bible, but there is some fire, some spice, some directness that is there as well. Achsah asks for what she wants. She doesn't hold back. And I don't know if this is okay, well, I've done what you said, so now I want this from you, or if this is just like she always wanted this. I grew up a bit of a daddy's girl, and there are definitely things like, I grew up on a farm, and so, it's like, yeah, I want the cows, or I want, I want to be able to stay on the farm, as I get older, and this is my favorite part of the farm, and I want to be able to keep, my tree house or something like that. I don't actually have a tree house, but I can see how, that you could just be attached to that part of your life. But she doesn't shy away from it. And whether she's asking Caleb directly or asking her husband to ask Caleb, she's very direct in saying, this is what I want. And both men hear her out. So the other two traits that I wrote down about her is that she is both respectful and respected. This goes along with the saying that you have to give respect to get respect. She does things in what we would think is the proper order. She doesn't go over her husband's head and just directly approach Caleb. She asks her husband to do this, which I think we would generally say is the, I guess, correct order of things. She's not, she's keeping the communication between her and her husband open, right? The decisions start there, and then they branch out because now this is your immediate family. But in both cases, her husband and her father respect her enough to grant these requests. Like, Othniel didn't have to go to Caleb and follow up this request that she's made, and Caleb didn't have to grant her the land. But not only does Caleb give her the land she's asked for, he's like, well, what all do you want? He's like, what do you desire? So he respects her enough to ask her what she wants, and then gives her exactly what she wants, which is a testament to the relationship between father and daughter, which again I think is interesting because this may be one of the only father-daughter stories we really get. Like, we know that like Rachel and Leah are the daughters of Laban, but we don't really get a whole lot of interaction. I mean, he gets upset when Jacob takes them away, but it's not this same kind of like, I don't know. It just feels very different. This story between Caleb and Achsah, this gives me daddy's girl type of vibes, I guess. And maybe I'm reading into that, but that's one of the things that I felt like was unique about Achsah and her story. Now, that being said, there are a couple of things that I don't know. As always, I wrote out some unknowns. We already talked about the fact that we don't know how she felt about the marriage and, what she felt towards how she was married off. Another thing we're not told is how old she is when this happens. Like, is she a teenager? Is she in her early 20s? Is she, a lot older? This also goes into some of the other things, like, has she already been given a chance to find her own husband and has failed to do so? So Caleb's like, okay, well, we're going to do it my way now, right? Um, we're not told any of that, just that he offers her hand in marriage. So she could have been very young. She could have been middle aged. Like, we really don't know. These are things that I think people just kind of assume based on their own perception of what it was like in that time period and what they think people were doing. But like I said, there are lots of possibilities. Um, and another thing I mentioned earlier was about how many brothers she has. The list gets a little confusing. But also, we're not told if she has any sisters. Did she have sisters? And if so, did the sisters get any land, or why weren't the sisters promised as a wife where some of them already married, or was she the eldest daughter? Lots of different things that aren't really told because I don't think that they matter in terms of what we're supposed to get from the story, but they do slightly color the story differently, right? If she's the eldest daughter or if she has uh, sisters that are already married, if she has no sisters at all, if she grew up, a girl amongst brothers, right? We know how that kind of changes how a person behaves and what they look like, what their personality looks like. So those are just interesting things to ponder. Um, the last two things I want to talk about concerning Achsah is the meaning of her name. We finally got away from the names that start with Abi or Abby. So we have a unique meaning here. Her name means ankle chain or anklet. And then the final thing I want to talk about is what it means to us today. I found so much spiritual parallelisms within this story. If you study the Bible diligently, there are passages where we're told explicitly that um, when you look at symbolism in the Bible, a woman represents a church. You see this with, for instance, the bride of Christ, right? There's a verse where it says, "I've likened Jerusalem to a comely woman," and so a lot of times when we're talking about prophecy, they will use like a woman to represent a church. We see this in Revelation. You have the true church represented as a woman who is hiding from the serpent in Revelation 12. And then you have the fallen church, the apostate church, being represented as the whore of Babylon in Revelation 17, which we will talk about both of them in turn, so I don't want to get off topic, but I do want to establish the basis for this idea of a woman representing a church. And when you think about that in terms of Achsah's story, what you get is the story of a father promising his daughter, or the father, God, promising his church to the man who can defeat the enemy, which would be the Messiah, right? The Messiah defeats Satan, and the church becomes his bride because he is able to protect and take care of the church. And of course, there are multiple passages where the Messiah talks about us getting our heart's desires and ask and you shall receive. And that is exactly what Achsah does. She asks for land or an inheritance or the kingdom. And her husband asks her father the same way we go through the Messiah, and he asks our father. And the father gives him what he has asked for, just as Messiah promises that whatever we ask of him, the Father will give to him and he will give to us. What is also interesting is that in this ask, she specifically calls out that she wants this land that contains springs of water. Water comes up so often in the Bible. We see in the end that there is a river flowing from the tree of life that is in New Jerusalem. There are rivers around the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Messiah refers to himself as the living water, and so she is requesting this water, this life-giving substance that is very important. And so, just in general, the overarching message in this story seems to mirror the gospel and the entire point of the Bible, which I thought was really interesting and, of course, is relevant to us today. And so, what I think it means for us is that we need to be like her and exhibit these traits where we should be obedient. We should be following what the Father has in store for us and asks of us without rebelling and without, you know, like I said, I grew up on Disney, and, you know, Disney teaches us some things that are not compatible with the Bible. The concept of following our own desires and our own following our heart and stuff like that. It's not necessarily, there's some nuance that we could get into, but I don't want to make this video too long. But essentially, making sure that we're following the Father's plan and not necessarily our plan is key to our success. But also, we need to be fearless in our speech. We shouldn't be afraid to speak up and ask for what we want from God, from those around us. Because when we are doing it in the correct way, when we are respectful and obedient and direct, beautiful things start to happen, and it comes together in the way that God intended. So that was a lot of what I got out of studying Achsah, and I thought that was a very beautiful study and a great place to end tonight's study. So thank you guys for tuning in, for joining. I hope you enjoyed our studies. We will be back next week, again, next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will be talking about some more women from the Bible. I, again, did not film myself journaling the next set of women that we will be talking about. So I'm not really sure how I'm going to construct that video. I will figure that out between now and next Friday. But I am excited to continue this study with you. I believe we are almost halfway through the letter A, maybe a little. I think maybe next week we will be halfway through the letter A. But I hope you enjoy it and follow along. And yeah, I will see you guys next week. In the meantime, all of this information is on the blog. You can like, share, subscribe, comment, all of those wonderful things. I love hearing from you guys, and I hope that your journaling is going well. One other plug as I finish up this page, I have been working on an outline for studying in 2026. If you are new to the channel, this particular journal came out of the fact that I have been doing journals on women of God for a while, and so the information I have was scattered across journals. But in particular, this year, 2025, I did a daily devotional journal on the women of God, and so I have, from January 1st up until current, where every day I've been studying the women of the Bible and writing entries about each woman. And I have information about that journal on the channel. It was very fun and very interesting to do. But instead of continuing the theme of women of God for the next year, since I'm going to be creating this alphabetical journal where everything is in one resource, I decided that next year I'm going to go through the Gospels. I have spent a lot of time studying the Old Testament and studying like Old Testament history. I actually took a class called History of the Old Testament when I was in college, and I guess I find it interesting because it's the stuff that we don't generally talk about. But recently I've been wanting two things, I guess. One is to spend more time reading the Word in general. I feel like the studies on these women, a lot of times each woman, there's only like 1 or 2 verses about them. And there's not necessarily a lot there. Whereas, I wanted to spend more time doing studies that are like, I guess, more concrete, where I'm reading, like a whole chapter a day or something, and I'm reflecting on what's actually there. So I wanted to switch topics and decided that the Gospels would be a great place to go to spend more time thinking about Jesus and who he is. So that is also up on the blog now if you want to start looking at that. I will make a video soon to talk about it, but that is forthcoming. Just giving you guys some previews of what to expect.